you're asking a little bit about my uncle's history and how he became involved in this whole Tom Thompson narrative. If I can remember correctly, Uncle Bill was born, I think, about 1919. And by the 30s, he was working up at the Taylor-Staton camps. And those are these lovely camps on Canoe Lake in Algonquin Park. Just a stunning part of the province, a stunning part of the country, as many places are. But he was the music director at the Taylor-Staton camps. And even in those days, in the 30s, sure, you were looking after lots of kids and lots of activities, but there's not that much to do after the kids were asleep. So he started to get interested in the lore of Thompson. And in those days, in the 30s, all the players were still alive. So one of the key individuals was Mark Robinson, who was the park ranger in Algonquin Park at the time of Thompson's death. And in fact, he may have been, insofar as the park was concerned, maybe Thompson's best friend. And so my uncle began interviewing all the folks that figure into this narrative, including Shannon Fraser, who owned a place called Mowat Lodge. And Shannon Fraser was a kind of a prickly fellow, and he was Thompson's landlord. And let's see, who else was up there at the time? There was the Trainer cottage and the Trainer family, and there was a daughter named Winnie Trainer. And Winnie, you know, I kind of feel this way about her, and I don't want to say anything, you know, having never met her, having never known her, but I would suggest that she sort of, you know, kind of impressed herself on Thompson, and I think it's more or less felt that he was a bit of a ladies' man. And primarily, he was a painter. Thompson would have met most of the Group of Seven members working at Grip Advertising, but it really didn't suit him. He would have worked with J.H. MacDonald, Arthur Lismer, Varley, possibly Carmichael. I'm not sure about Casson, maybe. He would not have worked with Lorne Harris. Lorne Harris, who of course is part of the Massey Harris family, was independently wealthy, if you will, but a very, you know, very sort of central person in terms of bringing the Group of Seven together. And as most folks know, that the Group of Seven was only formed after Thompson's death. So let's go back to what we were talking about, which was the folks that were present in Algonquin Park in the 30s when my uncle worked as the music director. So there was Shannon Fraser, that's the fellow who was Thompson's landlord. There was lovely Mark Robinson, the park ranger. We had the Winnie Trainer and her family. And then as far as my uncle's concerned, there was a family on Canoe Lake, I believe. I mean, all of those lakes are very much connected. Little Joe, you know, Tiny Joe. I'm very much kind of making up some names to lakes now, but there is a Little Joe Lake up in Algonquin Park at this point. And Martin Bletcher was the son in the Bletcher family, and they were Germans. And interestingly, you know, my uncle, who was involved as a flight instructor and in the Second World War, I think he maybe had a little bit of an edge. Perhaps I don't want to reference an axe to grind. I don't want to really be that sort of profound, but he really kind of implicates Martin Bletcher in the demise of Thompson. So my uncle just took it upon himself to interview all these people, and over the course of the summers that he was up there, and became really very, very curious about this enigmatic artist, Tom Thompson, who drowned at Canoe Lake, not in Canoe Lake. The medical evidence seems to indicate that Thompson died on dry land, not in the lake. When they found his body, what was noticed was that there was a little bit of blood coming out of his ears, and there was absolutely no water in his lungs. And the circumstances of his death were really very mysterious. The pertinent folk, in particular Shannon Fraser, indicates, and this is now we're flipping back in time to 1917, that Shannon Fraser indicates that he saw, and I hope I'm remembering correctly as well too, he saw Thompson canoe away with his lovely dove gray canoe, packed up for a week or two of travels, food, etc., panels, oil paints, etc., and headed off in the canoe. If I am recalling correctly, and this is, everybody's welcome to read the Tom Thompson mystery, which is in reprint again and available. The idea that Thompson sort of sailed away or paddled, that's really, to be more correct about it, he apparently paddled away, and wasn't really seen that he headed off in a certain direction. And it just didn't sit right with a few folk. And as I'm sort of thinking through the narrative on this and explaining things, he was gone, I suggest, for about a week, and people started to worry. And then I believe the incident that happened that made folks very suspicious, Mark Robinson in particular, was that Thompson's beautiful dove gray canoe was found in Canoe Lake. I believe it was about a week later. So people became very, very concerned about what had happened to this young painter. Thompson was just in his mid-30s at the time. There was a family renting a cottage on Canoe Lake, and it was Dr. Howland and his family, including his wife and his young daughter. And the way Thompson's body was found was that Dr. Howland and his daughter, and Dr. Howland was a surgeon for a World War I surgeon, but back in Canada. And these dear soldiers that were coming back were just terribly wounded, blinded, lost limbs, before we had a diagnosis of PTSD. But these dear brave fellows were in terrible shape. And Howland was actually suffering essentially from PTSD, and I believe it was his psychiatrist that suggested he take the summer off and go with his family into Algonquin Park, which was really very sort of open. It had been logging territory, Algonquin Park, but it was kind of new as cottage country. So Dr. Howland and his daughter are out fishing in an evening, about a week after, actually I think it's a little longer than a week, that Thompson had disappeared. And they were in a part of the lake that they knew reasonably well, and they got their fishing lines hooked on something. And I don't know if they caught a few little lake trout or what happened. They headed home, but in the morning, Thompson's bloated body was found floating in Canoe Lake. And the really suspicious element was that his I think it was his right ankle was wrapped 17 times very carefully with fishing line, which likely at that point in time maybe would have been a type of gut or something, like an animal fiber. So we're talking over 100 years ago now. And that would indicate that he was purposely put into the lake and tied down, moored down either with rocks or, something that he was meant literally to sleep with the fishes. There are other historians that think that may have indicated that he had a sprained ankle. However, if you're going to wrap fishing line around an ankle that carefully, that securely, that would amputate your foot eventually. That would cut off the circulation and amputate your foot. So when Thompson's body rises to the surface and it's discovered and it's in terrible condition, it's very bloated, folks are in extreme shock, and he's sort of gently pulled to one of the little islands in Canoe Lake, and his body is covered with a blanket. Now that blanket, I have no idea where that is, but if I just sort of interject a little bit with my own process in terms of being a visual artist, in particular with the story of Thompson, and my exhibition was titled Shadow Red. One of the things that I did was I chose to do, let's say, was I painted a number of the works on historic blankets. The reason being that Thompson was initially, when his body was found, he was covered in a blanket out of respect and heartbreak, I'm sure, with the people that cared for him and knew him. So we go back now. So we talked a little bit about the 30s, and now my uncle, and we're going to go to the year 1956. My uncle has several friends. He's working. I'm not even sure if my uncle was at that point was considered a judge, or called to be a judge. He was the first judge in the family court system that was not a lawyer by profession. So one of the things that Uncle Bill did was he gathered together a group of people that he knew. Leonard Gibbons, who is was a local fellow, kind of a strong local fellow. A friend of his, Jack Eastaugh, who was a painter. And another fellow, Frank Brott. And Frank Brott was, I believe he was a high school principal in Guelph. My uncle had run the Guelph Reformatory for a few years. These four fellows on Thanksgiving weekend of 1956 made the pilgrimage up to the Taylor-Staton camps, and they were determined, I believe it was the Sunday, it might have been the Monday, it was either the Sunday or the Monday. They knew where the Canoe Lake Cemetery was. There is a bit of consecrated land up there, and they were determined to head up with shovels and see if they were going to find the body at Canoe Lake in the cemetery.